Hello from the bus in Vietnam. It's actually just a local bus, not a tour bus. We're back home from holidays. I'm Ray, and I'm going to ask you, what has ABBA and Michael Learns to Rock got to do with Vietnam? Now, if you have ever travelled in Vietnam around New Year's, you will know that everywhere on New Year's week, even from Christmas time, everyone's playing Happy New Year by ABBA. Now, interestingly, ABBA never had any other hits in Vietnam except for Happy New Year. And this little unknown band called Michael Learns to Rock never saw fame basically anywhere in America, Australia, but a little bit in Europe, and never went anywhere else in it. But they were super, super popular in Vietnam, even today. I went to the hairdresser yesterday. They played Michael Learns to Rock. And if you don't know them, just look them up on YouTube and you can see some of their songs. Well, it actually has a really interesting story behind it. You see, in 1969, the war was in full swing. The Americans were seeking continued support by the Allied nations. And there were a lot of Allied nations that were involved. They included Canada, New Zealand, Australia, the Philippines, Malaysia, I believe, Indonesia. There were all these different countries that were involved in the Allied forces. And essentially it was the whole world against Russia, China, and Vietnam, essentially at the time, And there was one country that bucked the system. That was Sweden. In January of 1969, Sweden came out, the Prime Minister of Sweden came out and said, no, stop, no. We are not going to support the Americans in this war. And they recognised North Vietnam at the time as a sovereign nation. This is very important to the Vietnamese because Sweden was basically the only Western country to come out and say no. So it's like, right, we're going to recognise the communist North Vietnamese. And so they, in 1969, they got a diplomatic presence in Hanoi. And in 1970, they actually had a diplomat appointed to Hanoi to represent Sweden in Vietnam, in North Vietnam at the time. Now, on the other side, every other country that did have a diplomatic presence in Vietnam were ousted in the north. So there was no America, there was no France, there was no England, there was no Australia, there was no America. All of the embassies that had been kicked out. And the only ones that were still there were the ones that were supporting the country, which was China, Russia, and a few other small countries. So Sweden became the only Western country with a diplomatic presence in Vietnam. So fast forward, everything stayed the way it was in 1970 through 73. 72 and 73, the Allied forces retreated, and the Americans got out in 73, and there was a small training corps left in Saigon to support the South Vietnamese in the continued fight while they were trying to negotiate an end. All through that time, Sweden was the only Western country to have a diplomatic presence in the north. Move on to 1975, and Vietnam, North Vietnam, of course, wins the war. America leaves, and Vietnam unites to become one country. All embassies, all diplomatic presence of all Western countries are exited from the new one Vietnam until 1986. However, this is a really strange one. The only one to stay in the country as a diplomatic presence was Sweden. Now, so you can see there was one country there, Sweden. So on the other side, when they closed down the country in 1975 after the 30th of April victory, They also closed down all media links with the outside world. There's no news, no radio, no music, no nothing. And Vietnam's culture became very much, traditional, um, patriotic music, and it's still enjoyed and loved today, but especially by the older people, they still love it today. So from 1975 into 1986, there was no presence of music. However, there was a little back door. Sweden would send representatives from Sweden to Vietnam, and with it, they would bring Swedish music. Michael Learns to Rock, ABBA, etc. They wouldn't bring, they wouldn't bring the bloody Beatles or Bee Gees or anything like that. They brought Swedish music with them. So in a country that was locked out to the rest of the world, there was essentially, two or three or four Swedish bands that didn't get a, they didn't get to be played. They just had records come into the country, so people copied them. Vietnamese at the time were very ingenious in the way that they were able to share information, so they copied them on tapes, and so you had this, 99% of traditional Vietnamese music, and then this little slither of 1% of music from Sweden. And that's why Michael Learns to Rock and ABBA became so popular, because they were the only music from the outside world that got in through the Swedish diplomats. And 1986, everything opened back up, and life went on as normal. Strangely, music of the 50s and 60s and 70s all became new to the Vietnamese people, which is a totally different story, amazing story. But Happy New Year by ABBA and Take Me to Your Heart by Michael Learns to Rock became anthems of not just one generation, but multiple generations. And still today, you can go anywhere in Vietnam and you will hear those two songs being played. All because Sweden recognised North Vietnam as a sovereign nation in the middle of the war when every other Western country rejected it. Great story and totally true. She's feeling sick because she's on the bus. I'm not. I feel good. We're going to the city to do some work and buy some food, and we're going to enjoy the day. I'm Ray, an Aussie in Vietnam. That's Loan, a sick girl on the bus. See you soon. Bye-bye.